Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome. My name is Mary Novak, and I am part of the leadership team of the Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. For many of you, I think it is actually welcome back to White Supremacy in American Christianity. This is part 3. A consistent ethic of hate threatens our democracy. Today, Network continues the critical education and conversation we started last year with the thousands who joined us online, who felt drawn to getting their hearts and minds around this moment of building our multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, and multi-generational democracy. Confirming just how important this topic is, we had over 1,900 people and groups register for today's program, and we have at last count 19 generous sponsors, including 11 communities of Catholic sisters. So before we proceed, especially in light of the topic today, we acknowledge that in part due to the Doctrine of Discovery, the network main offices in DC occupy the unceded ancestral and traditional land of the Piscataway and Nancochtank peoples. If you are not familiar on whose land you occupy, we encourage you to take some time to learn your land's history. And here is a good resource. For those who know that history, let's pause for a moment for you to include your own acknowledgement wherever you are located right now. Thank you. Today, we are so grateful to welcome Dr. Kimberly Lymore, who serves as the director of the Tolton Pastoral Ministry Program at Catholic Theological Union and the convener of CTU's Black Catholic Theological Symposium. And she does this all the while that she serves full-time as Pastoral Associate Minister at the Faith Community of St. Sabina in Chicago. Dr. Lymore, thank you for praying us into this gathering today.
Spirit, we are one in the Lord, and we pray that all unity will one day be restored, and they'll know Christians by our love. Oh, them know we are Christians by our love. Yes, they will.
Come and all praise This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. They will know we are Christians not by our talk, but by our walk and by our love. This morning's prayer is actually adapted from a reflection from Bryan Massingale that now appears in The Fire This Time. I want to just ground us with a few scripture verses. John 8:12 tells us that Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. From John 8:31 through 32. And finally, when the Spirit of truth comes, the Spirit will guide you into all the truth. John 16:13. Come, Holy Spirit of truth. Give us the courage to speak uncomfortable truths, to face painful truths, to accomplish difficult truths, to dare powerful truths, to seek healing truths. Come, Spirit of truth, breathe within us and inspire us to speak words of wisdom and challenge, words of lament and sorrow, words of resolve and renewal, words of justice and accountability, words of welcome and inclusion, words of healing and peace. Come, Spirit of truth, and set us free. Come, Holy Spirit, into this virtual sacred space. Fill the hearts of your faithful. Enkindle and rekindle within us the fire of your love. It is not by our words, but only by our actions of love that they will know we are Christians. Send forth, O Lord, your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. And you, O God, will heal the land from poverty and homelessness, unemployment and unequal opportunity, racism and racial discrimination, gender inequality and sexual violence, child abuse and neglect. Oh Lord, heal us from substance abuse and addiction, climate change and environmental degradation, fanaticism and prejudice. And oh Lord, heal the land from war and genocide. And God, we know that you will renew the face of the earth. Let us all say, amen.
Amen. True truth, Dr. Lymore. Thank you. Now it is my absolute pleasure to welcome my beloved colleague, Joan Neal, who is the brainchild for this multi-year program. Joan serves on the leadership team here at Network, while she also serves as the inaugural Chief Equity Officer. Formerly, Joan served as Vice President of Caprini College and as Executive Vice President of Catholic Relief Services. Joan is an associate member of the National Black Sisters Conference, serves on a number of boards, and earlier this year was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Catholic Theological Union. Joan, please take it away, and please continue to lead the way.
Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon to all of you who have joined us today for what will be another challenging and stimulating conversation. White supremacy and American Christianity, a consistent ethic of hate, threatens our democracy. We are so fortunate to have with us again today Dr. Robert P. Jones and Father Bryan Massingale, who are both outspoken, prophetic voices on this urgent topic, warning us of this existential threat to our country and to our faith. Joining us today also, we have my colleague, Laura Peralta-Schulte, our Senior Director of Public Policy and Government Relations, and Darcy Hirsh, Senior Director of Policy at Interfaith Alliance, one of Network's important partners. Dr. Jones and Father Massingale will discuss white Christian nationalism as an ideology and a political force. And Darcy and Laura will talk about how it shows up in public policies and legislation. We will have a few questions from the audience, and we will close out with some final observations and comments from Dr. Jones and Father Massingale. Feel free to submit questions via text at 202-601-7871 or email at info@networklobby.org. You can submit your questions throughout the program. And now it's my pleasure to begin this conversation by introducing our two panelists. Dr. Robert P. Jones. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that looks at the nexus between religion, culture, and politics, and is the author of The End of White Christian America, which won a 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award, and his new book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, which is included on the New York Times bestseller list for 2023. Dr. Jones writes and speaks regularly on politics, culture, and religion for many online and major media outlets. And he is frequently featured in major national media such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many, many more. He also writes a weekly newsletter entitled White Too Long for those dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. You can find Robert's newsletter at robertpjones.substack.com. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and a BS in computing science and mathematics from Mississippi College. He currently serves on the National Program Committee for the American Academy of Religion. Joining Dr. Jones again is Father Bryan Massingale. Father Massingale is the James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University, as well as the Senior Ethics Fellow in their Center for Ethics Education. Prior to his appointment at Fordham, he was Professor of Theology at Marquette University. Father Bryan holds a doctorate in sacred theology from the Alfonsianum in Rome and a licentiate in sacred theology from Catholic University. He is the recipient of 4 honorary degrees and has held the Bernard J. Handley Chair at Santa Clara University and received Marquette University's highest award for teaching excellence in 2009. Professor Massingale is a leader in the field of theological ethics, nationally and internationally. He is a past convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. In addition to his academic pursuits, Father Massingale strives to be a scholar activist through serving faith-based groups advancing justice in society. He is the author of Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, as well as numerous articles, publications, presentations, and award-winning commentaries on racism and other social issues from a faith perspective. He is also an active participant and important public voice in a network of Catholic thought leaders striving for fuller inclusion of LGBTQ persons in society and the faith community. So, welcome, Robert and Bryan. Here we are back together again for our third conversation. We are so grateful for your willingness to continue in dialogue with us and our community on this dangerous and distorted topic. We had a great conversation in part 2 that has seemed to spark other additional discussions across the country about this troubling but important issue of the intertwining of American Christianity and American democracy and the ideology of white supremacy. Last October, you both mentioned some of the very real ways that white supremacy and its intersection with American Christianity is alive and evident in our society today. Political violence by so-called Christians and the belief that it is necessary has become increasingly visible. You also challenged us, especially you, Bryan. You called all Christians, particularly Catholic Christians, to exercise the virtue of courage, to tell the truth about this unholy, unchristian alliance of hate, heresy, and anti-patriotism before it destroys both our democracy and our Christian church. So today, we want to explore more deeply your insights into the ways in which white Christian nationalism threatens both democracy and the vision of the common good, embraced by our own Catholic social tradition and the tradition of other Catholics, of other Christians. We want to explore the historical and current manifestations of white Christian nationalism as it intersects with anti-Black and Indigenous racism, anti-Semitism, anti-LGBTQ identities, anti-inclusive democracy, white supremacy, and a false gospel of hate, so that we can all be prepared to tell the truth about it, to call it out wherever we see it. So, let's get started. Robert, you said in your New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, that origin stories are very important. They tell us who we are. And you locate the beginning of Christian nationalism and white supremacy in the 15th century Papal Bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V and others, known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And Bryan, you say it goes back even farther than that, all the way back to like 312 AD, when Constantine converted to Christianity and declared that it was the official religion of the Roman Empire worldwide. But, no matter the exact date, this fusing of Christianity and state power has shaped the beginnings of our culture and life in this country. It served as the basis for subsequent enslavement of Black people and the systematic slaughter and forced relocation of Indigenous people. But interestingly enough, this is not the version of the story of us that is typically told, even to this day. And now we are seeing a rising movement to expunge this history from our educational system, to ban books that tell the truth about it. Why is this history, these connections, so threatening to some people that they are willing to corrupt our Christian faith and destroy even our democracy to prevent the truth from becoming widely known?
Well, you set the table so well there for us. So let me first say I'm so happy to be back here with Father Massingale and Joan and Mary. Thank you so much for hosting, and Network for hosting, and all the co-hosts as well. This is such an important conversation. As you say, the themes we're talking about today are right out of the headlines. Every week, we see something. And it's notable, I think, to me, to pick up on your last point, that history has become one of the biggest fault lines of the culture wars in the United States, one of the biggest fault lines in our political fights. And it's worth asking, why that is today. So why is it that these questions of who we are, and in the American context, it often comes in this flavor of who is truly an American, right? Who is this country for? Like, those kinds of questions are really what we're wrestling with. And, we do get, all of us are kind of born into a history that's already flowing. And so it's like sort of sitting beside a river, and you see, part of it flowing by, and there's, certain currents, it's going a certain speed, it's going a certain direction. You see where the banks are, but it's hard to see kind of further upstream, right? And so one of the things that, I've been doing in this latest book is to try to push back upriver and say, how did we get here? And why are we fighting over these things today in 2023? And what does it mean? And part of that pushback upriver was like, where, and particularly for this conversation, and really for the American context in general, Christianity played a very significant role in creating these narratives that we've inherited about who we are. And it's notable too that, for those who look like me, I mostly British heritage, grew up in the South. And so for those who look like me with my background, there's a very self-congratulatory narrative out there about how we got here, right? And particularly for white Christian people, how we got here, and particularly in the kind of place at the top of the power pyramid, in control, those kinds of things are part of that story. So, these Genesis stories really make a difference. I want to get to the Doctrine of Discovery. Just kind of set the table real quickly, though, that it's notable that we've been fighting over these years. So, we had just this recent big cultural fight over 1619 versus 1776, these 2 years. And I write about that in the first chapter of the new book. And what was that about? Well, I used to collect postage stamps, right? And I remember very clearly this one postage stamp that is 1776. And what's in that little frame of this postage stamp are all white men sitting in their colonial finery, awkwardly posed around a table with their quill pens, signing the Declaration of Independence, right, in Philadelphia in 1776. Now, if that is our Genesis story, all we really have to account for is what's in that initial frame, right? Whatever story follows, the only thing that has to be told is the subsequent story of what happened with those folks who were in that room. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts that the 1619 Project gave to the country, was really decentering that and blowing that frame up and saying, no, we have to back up. And if for those of you who remember, the original New York Times issue that published the 1619 Project also had an image. And that image that came with it was this vast ocean. And it was fairly ominous. It was a sort of dark, kind of almost black water with a gray sky and an endless horizon line out there. And that was intended to evoke a very different view, right, of kind of the transatlantic passage way. And particularly the story was about the arrival of Africans who had been kidnapped, brought across the waters against their will, and destined for enslavement in Virginia in the early British colonies. Now, if we begin with that Genesis story, we have to tell a very different narrative in order to account for where we are. I'm going to suggest, and Bryan can blow me all the way back up another 1,000 years, but I'm going to suggest, at least if we're thinking about the the proximate causes of where we are and telling a fuller story, we need to go back and kind of pull the camera back even further there, because even at 1619, Indigenous people, the European interaction with Indigenous people is more than a century old, even at 1619. So we've got to kind of bring it all the way back. And I'm going to I suggest and argue that one place that is worth our pausing as another way of telling a Genesis story of how we got here, who we are, what is this country, is 1493. Not 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as many of us learned in little rhymes in elementary school, but the next year, because what happens that next year is that Columbus goes back, right? And he says, look, I want to go back. He wasn't aware that he had discovered new lands. He thought he was, at that point, in India, but in Asia. But nonetheless, he said, I'm going to go back, and what I need is more ships, more soldiers, more missionaries. But the thing that often gets overlooked is that he wanted a moral mandate for what he was doing. And so who did he look to for that moral mandate? Well, he looked to the church for that moral mandate. And in the 15th century, there had already been a kind of decades-long conversation and actually papal edicts that were stemmed by a kind of theological crisis. And the theological crisis was, what's our responsibility toward these people that we didn't know existed, toward these lands that we didn't know existed? And the political rulers were looking to various popes in the 15th century. And these papal bulls, or kind of opinions, official rulings by the Vatican, came to be known collectively as the Doctrine of Discovery. And that Columbus's visit in 1493 precipitates one of the last ones there. And essentially, they are wrestling with this story, with this challenge, this theological conundrum about what to do and what responsibilities Europeans had vis-a-vis these other peoples. And it essentially boiled down to this. There's a lot of theological apparatus, but when you boil it down, it comes down to one question. And the question about whether other people had human rights came down to this question: are they Christian?
Yes.
And if the answer to that was no, a whole series of things followed. First of all, they were to be considered enemies of Christ. That's the language out of these documents, this very bellicose language. And then there was explicit justification given by the church to the political powers to, if they resisted, to confiscate their land, to steal their goods. And in the words, again, these are penned straight from the Vatican, in the words of the Vatican, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right, that is in these documents. And so, if we think about this kind of voyage of Europeans into the Americas, and particularly and the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas, what we see is that what set the moral compass for those voyages was, in fact, Christian theology. From the highest authority of the Christian church in the West, and it was this setting, this moral setting, that really is the version of Christianity that arrives on these shores. And so, taking that very seriously, I think, is a real challenge. I think because it's not the story at all that we get taught. But I am reminded here of we have testimony of non-white Christians telling us different versions of this story all along. Just a couple of quick examples. I'll turn it over to Bryan. Frederick Douglass, right? He spends the entire appendix of his first autobiography in 1845 excoriating the Christian church. He says, between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land, I find the widest possible difference. And he goes on, it is just an excruciating read. He says, we have the church bells and the slave auctioneers' bells chime in unison. We are selling human beings to fund the purchase of Bibles to take across to the supposed heathen. Just names all these hypocrisies. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the version of history that was most dominant as a white fairy tale. There. And I'm going to read one thing from James Baldwin here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bryan, because it's something that's really stayed with me in terms of how Baldwin talks about the history that many of us have told, these Genesis stories that are completely out of touch with the reality here. And he says this is from The Fire Next Time. The American Negro has the advantage of having never believed the collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all other neighbors and inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile, that American women are pure. And then he goes on, and at the end of the day, he's at the end of the quote, he's talking about how African Americans think about white people, and how African Americans have felt actually little hatred, less hatred than one might think. And he says this, and this is for those, again, who share my background. The tendency has been, insofar as this was possible, to dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And I really try to take that very seriously, that we have told these myths, really lies, about ourselves, to justify and to cover up the injustices. And I think this moment that we are in a moment of reckoning in this country. And as we are moving to tell the truth, to liberate ourselves from these lies, we are experiencing a lot of pushback in the country that's characterizing, and I think, the principal fault lines of our politics today.
Thank you, Robbie, so much for laying the table for us so beautifully. And I also want to thank Network for continuing this important conversation. So thank them for providing the space for this. And also wanted to just give a special shout out to my sister, Kim Lymore, for that beautiful prayer service, and for quoting me better than I could quote me. So, I mean, you prayed the prayer much better than I could. But I think that the word truth is really important. And also the origin story that you told there, Robbie, talking about how we really need to look at that doctrine of discovery, because I think what it really does for us, and what you do so beautifully in your work, is that you've given us the origin of where this conflation between Christian and European comes from, and Christian and white comes from. That's the heritage here. And I think that's really important, because we kind of wonder, where does this come from? And you told us, I mean, from this doctrine of discovery, basically anyone who was non-European, and at that point, European and Christianity were coextensive with one another. There's a perfect overlap between the two. That is the deep root of where we are now with this ideology of white Christian nationalism. And to understand the contemporary manifestations and effects of that deep nexus between white and Christian, European and Christian, we need to come to this shore then, and to see that in this country, what makes it so pernicious is not only are white and Christian conflated, but that white becomes more than just a skin color. White is a social status in this country. And I think part of our origin story is to understand that white has never simply been a skin color, it's been a social status. And so we see in our country efforts by immigrants to go to court to sue for the right to become white. And so we see Japanese Americans, South Asians going to court for the right to become white. And the Supreme Court in these decisions basically saying, well, you may be, biologically Caucasian, but you are not white the way we understand white. And I think it's very important to understand, it's so difficult for white Americans, I think, to understand that whiteness goes beyond mere skin color, and that it's always been contested. I point out to people that Greek Americans didn't become white until 1940. Mexican Americans were considered white until 1930, then they lost their white status. So the boundaries of whiteness have always been fluid, and that means the boundaries of who's really Christian have also been fluid. And that leads to the theme for the title for this particular conversation, and that is that white supremacy is a consistent ethic of hatred. And when we understand our origin story and we see the conflation between whiteness and Christianity, And then when we see how whiteness has always been contested in our history, then we can understand how white supremacy is not simply anti-Black. White supremacy is also anti-immigrant. White supremacy is also anti-Semitic. White supremacy is also Islamophobic. White supremacy is also misogynistic. White supremacy is also anti-LGBTQ. As I told my white gay friends, in the ideology of white supremacy, your skin may be white, but you're not truly white or not white enough. And that's why in my presentations I've been taking to say that if you do a Venn diagram, I learned about Venn diagrams when I was a logic student in college. It's the one thing I loved about just diagramming things. If you take the devotees of white nationalism, Christian nationalism, and those who are anti-immigrant, and those who are anti-LGBTQ, and those, if you start over, you see the great overlap between them. And so your origin story helps us understand how did Christianity and whiteness become conflated. And then when we come to this shore, we see how whiteness itself is a very fluid construct, but at the same time defined not simply in terms of skin color, but in terms of social status. And that is why this ideology of white Christian nationalism is an intersectional threat, a consistent ethic of hatred. And for Catholics who are listening, you see resonances between a consistent ethic of life that we talk about in the Catholic Church. Well, white Christian nationalism is a consistent ethic of hatred. And that is why it's a very intersectional threat. It's not simply benefiting white people, but it's benefiting the right kind of white people. So it's a defense of a very conservative, traditional America, rooted in this idea that what Christianity should have a privileged place in this country, because after all, the Doctrine of Discovery grants to the New World, that Christianity is supposed to have a privileged place in this newly aware world that the Europeans have become aware of. But now the history continuing from that point is, how does Christianity become defined and how does whiteness become defined? And that's where we are right now in this deep cultural war that we're in. Who counts as white and Christian? Whose country is this? And so we see that white Christians are now arising using the defense of traditional morality as kind of a banner, but it's really a defense of the traditional holders, white men primarily, as holding legitimate social, cultural, and political power. So yeah, this is I really think that your book is tracing the deep roots of this. But then when we turn to this country, then we see how whiteness and Christianity become continually defined, but it comes from that deep nexus that whiteness and Christianity have this privileged role in American society. And this is where the battles are being fought to continue that this should be a white Christian nation as defined by the holders of white Christian power. Wow. That's a lot.
It does a lot.
That's a lot.
One quick comment. I know we're going to get to another question here, but what you're describing, Bryan, I don't know if you use the word, but what you're describing is is hierarchy, right? And it's that's such an integral part of this worldview of the Doctrine of Discovery, and it's part of the logic, right? So that God created European Christians at the top of the human pyramid, right? And everyone else, if they're not white and Christian, is European or Christian, is intended to be by God, right? That's the theological claim here, right? Intended by God to be below those people. And it's important to know that it's also gendered, right? It is straight white men at the top of that category. And there's not even a category for LGBTQ people, right? It's just men, women, and men over women. That's the only categories there are in this very strict kind of hierarchy. And that, I think, is the real challenge if one believes in equality and racial equality, gender equality, and democracy, right, is built on that fundamental belief of equality. You start to see why this old thing that we now talk about as white Christian nationalism. I think there's a good reason for doing that, but it has this long tail through history, right, that is always an anti-democratic, fundamentally anti-democratic threat.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what you just said there is really key. It was divinely ordered. This is the will of God. And I think that's really key for understanding the current debates that we're in, is that we see people who are willing to use violence in the will to exercise the will of God. That if God has willed this, then that order must be protected by any means necessary. And it leads then to a conversation about violence in our democracy, or in our country right now, and how it imperils, democracy. We're seeing a vivid understanding of this in contemporary events, in terms of seeing the efforts of the Republicans to select a new Speaker of the House, and how many of the Republican representatives are reported receiving death threats, and that this appeal to violence is nakedly on display. And we should point out that they're just the latest manifestation. Now it's finally GOP, Republicans, white men who are recipients of these violent threats. We should point out that African Americans have always been recipients of these violent threats. White supremacy is inherently violent. Liz Cheney received these kinds of violent threats. January 6th was a very violent statement that multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy is absolutely repugnant to those who believe in the white Christian project. And they did this in the name of God. That at January 6th, they had sacred symbols that legitimated with their cause. And so I think you're absolutely right that what we see here is this deeply dangerous conflation of the defense of a divinely ordered hierarchy and the use of violence, if necessary, to preserve that hierarchy at any cost. And so these people are not defenders of democracy. In fact, that's the last thing they want, because multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy is an existential threat to that divinely ordered hierarchy.
Indeed. A rich conversation that started with an origin story that we have told ourselves that in fact belies the truth of the facts, and has brought us to this moment, as both of you have talked about. And you actually have anticipated my second question, which is really about this moment. We've seen the clear manifestation of Christian nationalism and white supremacy increase in the last few years, even in this current year. And Bryan, you just mentioned that, we have had an avowed white supremacist and Christian nationalist to be nominated for the position of Speaker of the House of Representatives. If that is not a clear indication of where we are with the Christian nationalism and white supremacy, I'm not sure, how much farther we have to go. Researchers, social scientists, and experts in good governance are telling us that our democracy is showing clear signs of failing. You both have written about it. You've spoken about it. You've just now talked about it. But as you see it, what are some of the warning signs of this time, this moment, that make this moment such an existential threat to our American and Christian way of life? What have your surveys told you, Robert? Bryan, what are you hearing in the Christian circles, in the Catholic Christian circles?
You want to start with the sociological data, Robbie, what your studies have
Sure.
shown?
So I'll just say, Bryan, what you were talking about Venn diagrams, this overlap between these views of white Christian nationalism, and I'll kind of take it out of the jargon for a minute. I mean, this is sometimes get skeptics that there really is no such thing as white Christian nationalism, just something you sociologists made up, to talk about things. But let me give you some other terms that how it survives in our national ethos, right? Manifest destiny, right, is something I got taught about, right, in American history. That idea is straight from the Doctrine of Discovery, and what we're calling today, white Christian nationalism. The idea of America as a new promised land, a new Zion, right? That language is very, very prevalent in our political, a city set on a hill, even, right? We get that right out of the New Testament, but when it's used in political space, it means something quite different. And Winthrop, John Winthrop, is famous for kind of uttering that in the early history of the country. But if you had asked his indigenous neighbors about whether they saw his little settlement as a city set on a hill, they would have said, no, actually, what we see, that's a source of violence towards us, right? And so these things survive in kind of colloquial ways. We've actually asked people in recent political surveys. We did a big study with the Brookings Institution at PRI last year on Christian nationalism, and when we measured it, we actually asked people outright, like, do you agree or disagree that this country was ordained by God? We got that language in there as a promised land for European Christians. So he asked that so it's got whiteness, it's got ordained by God, it's kind of promised land language. And 3 in 10 Americans said yes, they agree with that sentiment. And now that means that 2/3 of the country rejects it. So that's good news, because that is a fundamentally anti-democratic way of thinking about the country. But 3 in 10 agreed with it. And if we look and see who agreed with it, it is a majority of white evangelical Protestants who agree with that statement. And it is a majority of one of our 2 political parties. A majority of Republicans today agree with that statement. And it's important to note that our 2 political parties are sorting themselves along lines of race and religion in really dangerous ways for democracy. The Republican Party today is 70% white and Christian in a country that is only 42% white and Christian. The Democratic Party is about 25% white and Christian. So when we see like these very different the ways that the 2 parties are sorting themselves, and that it's a majority holding this Doctrine of Discovery view of a divinely ordained country for white Christians. Here we see what the stakes are, and when we look at the correlates, you're exactly right. It correlates with anti-Muslim sentiment. It correlates with anti-immigrant sentiment. You can see it in the data. It correlates with anti-Semitic views. And anti-LGBTQ views, right? It also correlates with patriarchal views of men and women in the country. So all those things come along for the ride here. And then probably the most disturbing thing, though, is that those who believe that, and again, this is from our study with PRI and the Brookings Institution earlier this year, for those who believe that America is a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, they are 3 times as likely as Americans who do not believe that to say that political violence may be necessary to save the country. Say that again. They are 3 times as likely as those who disagree with that sentiment to say that political violence might be necessary to save the country. Now, we should all be very worried about that. And it's worth noting that, Joan asked about kind of the current signs. We used to be able to say with pride that we have had 44 successive presidential elections that with a peaceful transfer of power. We can no longer say that anymore. Right. That is no longer a mark of American democracy. Our last election was marred with bloodshed, violence, and deaths. January 6th. And just the last thing I'll say here, and I'll hand it over to you, Bryan, is you're absolutely right about January 6th. On the last frame of the video that the House Select Committee showed, there is a scene that looks like it's out of like Les Mis. There are people standing up on these kind of knocked over barricades, and they're flying 2 flags. One of those flags is a Trump flag, and the other flag is a white flag with a blue square and a red cross in the corner, which is the Christian flag. It was adopted by the National Council of Churches in the 1940s. Like, those are the two flags that are being flown and being kind of declared. They're kind of staking their claim in the same way that Columbus and De Soto and all those other European folks did. I mean, they not only planted the flags of Spain and Portugal, but they erected crosses at the same time as a way of laying claim to territory.
Thank you for that. And what makes it so dangerous in a Catholic perspective, and I'm going to bring it to the Catholic perspective, is that just as you said that the two political parties are sorting themselves out on this issue of white Christian nationalism, and the Republican Party, a substantial part of their base and their public policies are committed to this end. We cannot be politically naive about that. And where that intersects with Catholicism is that for many, many years, there's been a stigmatization of the Democratic Party, especially by the United States bishops. And the way it sorts itself out is by, they're saying in Faithful to Citizenship, the document that's given to guide Catholics in our political discernment every election year, presidential election year, is that abortion is the preeminent moral issue. And the way preeminent gets translated on the ground is that abortion is the only issue. It's the trump card issue. And that means that no matter what else a candidate may stand for, as long as they are rhetorically against abortion, then Catholics then have to give support or allegiance to that party or to that particular person. That then gives Catholics a cover then to plausibly vote for a party that basically stands for white Christian nationalist values with all their intersectional threats to democracy. And it gives, without them having then to say, well, I'm really voting for them because of this. And so I think we really need to, as Catholics, we really need to look at this. We're going to see it again with the coming election year. Every year we have Catholics groups that put out these voter guides called about the Catholic non-negotiable issues, which are basically abortion and LGBTQ issues and religious liberty. But religious liberty for this crowd doesn't mean the right to exercise your faith. What it means is defending a privileged role for traditional Catholic Christian moral values, that those have to have a privileged place in American society. And so I think we really need to look at this in terms of what this means in terms of if the two political parties are sorting themselves out and one party is basically saying that democracy is not valid if we don't win. And Catholics on the other hand are saying you must support this. I remember, for example, being told that if you voted for President Obama, you've committed a mortal sin. You have to go to confession before you can receive communion. And I'm sure that rhetoric is familiar to many who are listening for us today. That shows the kind of ways in which the U.S. bishops have postured themselves to say that only one political party, in this case, the party of white Christian nationalism, we have to be blunt about this, is the one that Catholics must support because of their stance on abortion being this preeminent moral issue. And this is why many Catholics said that they voted for Trump because of his supposedly this pro-life stance, even though it's not pro-life, it's pro-birth. Let's be honest about this. And even though he seldom appealed to abortion in the closing days of his campaign was all about racial grievance. And yet a majority of white Catholics supported that platform and were given cover by their bishops under the guise of abortion being the preeminent moral issue. What this means basically is that Catholics have to become far more nuanced and sophisticated in our political analysis and our political discernment. Because if we don't, then by default, we are basically saying that the party of white Christian nationalism is the party that we must give our allegiance to, regardless of anything else they stand for, because of their purity on one particular issue. And I want to note also that Trump seems to be moving away from the Republican ideology of an absolute ban on abortion And so even there, I think we see that his, anti-abortion cred is, a very strategic one. It's very transactional. It's not very sincere. But I do think that we as Catholics have got to be more sophisticated in our political discernment, or we will by default find ourselves officially endorsing a party of white Christian nationalism.
Yes, and I think that you are both correct in the sense that as people of faith, we have to use both our faith and our reason to discern what the truth is, not just about our origin story, not just about what we are seeing in terms of political violence or political rhetoric today, but also in terms of the moral dimensions of our declaration that we are Christians, that we are followers of the Christ, who, Father Bryan, you said, gave us the symbol of the cross as the way in which we are known. And that is just exactly, has been a symbol that has been co-opted, but it is exactly the focus that we should have as citizens and as people of faith. And it's interesting, you just now talked about, certain candidates whose rhetoric says one thing and their actions say another. We have a couple of questions, and I think it's now time for us to turn to our audience and see if we can entertain some of those questions. And someone in the audience says, can you discuss hijacking of language in this ideology? The January 6th insurrection was called patriotism by Trump and others. How does media and the use of language support this ideology of Christian nationalism?
I think what this suggests is that if you're going to be a patriot, then you have to give uncritical allegiance to your country and to its leaders or its designated leaders. Or another way of putting this, any criticism of the United States, any criticism of the country by pointing out its origin story, pointing out that our origin stories are far more complicated than 1492 and Columbus discovering America, far more complicated than 1776 being this American rebellion in terms of freedom, especially since Indians weren't includred in that, and certainly persons of African descent weren't included in the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, as the Supreme Court declared in the Dred Scott decision. But what we're seeing is that patriotism means you cannot tell a true story. I think that's the danger of this language, that anyone who would raise a more critical or a more complicated or a more nuanced story, or as Baldwin would say, a more truthful account of our story, is therefore unpatriotic. And what it does, again, it conflates whiteness, Christianity, and patriotism all together. And so patriotism becomes, therefore, a defense of white Christian nationalism. That you're a true patriot if you defend the fact that this country was intended by God to be a land where Europeans would find favor. And so I think that this is where the language is really important here. Who is a genuine patriot? And I think it's always been the case in African American history. Let's face, Martin Luther King was not considered a patriot. The civil rights advocates were not considered patriots. Abolitionists in our country were not considered patriots. Those who were advocating for women's suffrage were not considered patriots. And so we have to be very careful and critical about this use of this language, because underneath the language of patriotism isn't love of country, but it's love of a particular way of conceiving this country. And I think that's what we need to be very careful of, and we need to be very critical of.
Yes. Robbie, any thoughts on that question?
That is so well said. I think we should just go to another question. Yeah. Thank you, Bryan.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So someone else asks, what are the best strategies for convincing our far-right Christian and Catholic members that this consistent ethic of hate is patently not of the gospel? What can we do to diffuse the powerful narrative of the right wing?
I'll say a little bit about that. I'm going to answer this, I think, as a sociologist first, but one with some theological training. I think we've got to take seriously that this vision of the Doctrine of Discovery is truly Christian. Now, I'm going to say, now I know that makes us recoil, right? We want to say, no, that's not Christian. No, that's not the gospel. God doesn't actually have Europeans up here and everybody else down here. Right? We want to sort of affirm that. But I think what we're really doing is laying claim to a different thread of Christianity that has often been lost. That's not often been the dominant thread in Christianity. That's what theologians do. They sort of like look in the tradition and sort of like see where we've lost our way, right? And try to kind of bring us back. And I think it's important to say that for the Confederate leaders who prayed to God and thanked God for the Confederacy, right? And they were actually professing an authentic Christian faith from their point of view, right? And that was a lived version of Christianity. So, I was thinking about this early song, and I'll tell you a bit where I am. So I grew up singing that song, and version of that they will know we are Christians by our love, right? But if we look at American history, if we ask Indigenous people, who, by the way, Indigenous scholars were the ones who have kept this attention on the Doctrine of Discovery, particularly in the American context. Vine Deloria Jr., Tink Tinker, and others. Vine Deloria Jr. wrote a letter in 1972 called An Open Letter to the Christian Leaders of the Churches of North America that was summarily ignored, where he asked them to give an account of the Doctrine of Discovery and how it explained where they were. But, when I think about that song, they'll know we are Christians by our love. If we had asked, and Douglas and King and Baldwin, I think, and Indigenous leaders like Deloria and Tinker, give us a hint of this. Like, if you ask them, how would you know they are Christian? I think the heartbreaking answer to that is they might have said, and many of them would have said, they'll know we are Christians by our greed. Mm-hmm. They'll know we are Christians, by our duplicity. And they'll know we are Christians by our violence. And if we don't want that to be our story, we really are going to have to work hard to reject what was actually done in the name of Christ and the church, right? And to blaze a different path. But it's going to take actually rejecting that, because it is in our DNA. That's the thing. It is in us. And so we've got to have to telling the truth is going to require a kind of self-examination of what's in our hymns, what's in our liturgy, what's in our theology, to really mark a different path, because it has been the dominant voice of Christianity in this country's history.
I agree that it has been the dominant voice. I think what gives me hope and what the strategy is that it's not the only voice. There's always been a subterranean protest movement, or a better way of putting it, prophetic movement in Christianity. And we need to do a better job of lifting up that narrative. That's also part of our Christian story, that the Doctrine of Discovery and its impact, while it was dominant, has never been completely unchallenged. And I think what we need to do is and I think you're doing in your book, Robbie, is to resurrect the alternate narratives that people are trying to act out of, and swimming upstream with it too. Over my shoulder, you see a picture of Sister Antonia Ebo, one of the sisters who marched with King at Selma, African-American sister, one of the sisters of Selma. We need to do a better job, especially in the Catholic Church, of lifting up that narrative and those narratives. We need to do a better job in terms of the iconography in our churches. When we go into our churches, you can be forgiven for thinking that only white people are populating heaven when you go to most churches. And that's
and that Jesus is white.
And
right?
Jesus is white. And there was a study that was done in Stanford University in January 2021 that basically said that if you believe that a white man rules the heavens, then you should believe that white men should rule here on earth. Yeah. And so when we think about the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we have to be very critical about what our visions of heaven are like. And so one of the things I think we need to do is we need to lift up the fact, the other stories that have been present, the prophetic stories, the protest movements that have also been inspired by Christian faith. I think that one of the disservices we do, if we look at the civil rights movement, for example, we want to talk about, Dr. Martin Luther King. We don't want to say he's a reverend. And we need to talk about the fact that he did what he did because of his Christian faith. And he did so knowing that his fellow Christians were ostracizing him. His letter from Birmingham City Jail, for example, was directed at white Christian leaders who posed as moderates. His letter is really a strong critique of the American version of Christianity, which is at peace with racial subjugation and racial hierarchy. And we need to tell that story and to teach that story as a counter-religious narrative. Douglas's book, you talk about his first autobiography, wasn't a rejection of Christianity as much as it was a rejection of a particular kind of Christianity. And so what can we do for convincing right-wing Catholics? I don't know if we can always convince right-wing Catholics, but I do think that we can, if we start telling better stories, more honest stories, lifting up suppressed and ignored stories, and looking at the iconography of our churches and the ways in which we image the sacred and the divine, then we can move a little further along the way of creating a more powerful counter narrative to fight against the dominant narrative of defensive hierarchy, which we seem to be saddled with right now.
I'll just jump in real quick. I just want to say one thing about King. That letter from Birmingham jail, still haunts me. Yes. Because it describes so I didn't grow up Catholic, but it grew up Baptist, but it describes the white churches that I grew up in. He has this just searing phrase where he says, who are these white Christians sitting safely behind the security of stained glass windows, right? But behind the anesthetizing security.
In other words,
there's
something about their faith that puts their consciences to sleep.
Yeah.
And then he also, in that same letter, he talks about touring the South and seeing these churches with their spires pointing heavenward and asking the question, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? And then in a later interview where he was asked what was one of the greatest mistakes of his movement, and he says, the greatest mistake of my movement was overestimating the spiritual integrity of white ministers. I think we need to lift up those voices in terms of the powerful counter narrative of right-wing bishops, and to realize that critique of King is maybe even more relevant today than it was when he first gave it. I hate to say that so baldly, but I really do believe that overestimating the spiritual integrity of white Christian leaders. I go back to that over and over again, and I say, what a damning indictment. And yet, how buried that indictment is. How would King Day be different if that was what we lifted up, rather than the bland sentiment, I have a dream, that most of our kids don't even know what that dream is.
Yeah. And if every seminarian read Vine Deloria's an open letter to the Christian churches of North America, right?
Yes,
And
exactly.
asking them to account for the way they've treated indigenous people in the country.
Oh, yeah.
Indeed. Narrative is important. And I do think that, it was a sobering statement that you made, Robbie, that, what we have seen from the fusion of American Christianity and white supremacy is Christianity, is the version of Christianity that those people who believe in that ideology have grabbed onto and has motivated their actions and their beliefs to this day.
And not only that, but that you see many young white Catholics who are latching onto that version of Christianity and doing so in the name of defending or being faithful to tradition.
Yes.
And so it's wanting to ground yourself in a tradition is a very beautiful thing. We have to be critical of what kind of traditions are you grounding yourself in.
Absolutely.
And because that's Christianity and that's what they're grounding themselves in, then you see the perpetuation of this divinely ordained hierarchy and doing it in the name of being faithful to tradition.
Yes. And I also have to say, I guess, that, if we're asking what the true meaning of Christianity is, we only need to consult Scripture. We only need to hear again the words that Jesus said in the Good News. And I would say that is polar opposite to what we are
It's very
seeing today.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the GOP congressmen was interviewed yesterday and said, I'm not even sure that Jesus could be elected as the Speaker of the House of Representatives, which is a very, he probably said it very tongue-in-cheek, but it's a very telling observation that even this party that touts itself as standing for Christian values could not endorse the founder of Christianity. So I just think that as a leader, I just think that it shows the gap between American Christianity as we define it and the Christianity of Christ.
Yes, absolutely. And it is indicative of the moment that we are in today, both in our churches and in our democracy. Well, once again, my friends, it's clear that we could talk for a very long time. We've had a very wide-ranging and informative conversation. But now it is time for us to transition to the next part of our program. And our two next speakers will talk with us about the concrete ways in which white supremacy and white Christian nationalism show up in our civic and political life. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next two panelists, my colleague, Laura Peralta-Schulte, Network's Senior Director of Policy and Government Relations, and Darcy Hirsh, Senior Director of Policy at the Interfaith Alliance, who will have a conversation about the real-life ways in which white Christian nationalism seeps into our laws, into our public policies, and into our politics. Laura, Darcy.
Thank you so much, Joan and Darcy. It is so wonderful to be sitting here with you on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Before we jump in, was there anything that hit you in terms of what you just heard from Robert and from Bryan? I must admit, being a very close watcher of all things happening in Congress, the idea that Jesus or any religious leader could be elected is a stunning statement. I do not see that happening. But what was your impression as we dig into the policy side?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to Network for hosting this incredible discussion today. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it was really wonderful to listen to Dr. Jones and Father Massingale kind of opine for the last session, and for me to think about how that's impacting our public policy. And as you said, it's just so current with the failure of Representative Jordan to win the speakership, and that being, alluded to, well, if he can't win, then Jesus Christ himself couldn't win, and that's just a demonstration of how pervasive Christian nationalism has become in our government. One other thing that really stood out to me was really at the beginning of the conversation when Dr. Jones was talking about Christian nationalism, kind of flipping the narrative of who is this country for, and that's something that I know you and I are going to discuss when we talk about the implications of policy.
Let's get right into it then. So in terms of policy, we have for a long time known that state and local communities act really as a laboratory for new policy ideas, and sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. So I would like you to begin our conversation by telling us a little bit about the issues you are seeing in communities across the country pushed by Christian nationalists.
Thank you for that. As we've just learned, Christian nationalism is neither Christian nor nationalist. It's an effort by a small group to push values based in a very narrow view of faith. And at my organization, Interfaith Alliance, we are committed to protecting true religious freedom and fighting for an inclusive democracy, both on the federal level with Congress and the administration and throughout states around the country. And Christian nationalism plays out in many ways. I'm going to talk about 3 examples today, looking at state houses and state legislatures and the courts. The first is religion in schools. The second is with anti-LGBTQ legislation. And the last is around our democracy more broadly, voter suppression, election protection, et cetera. So when you think about Christian nationalism, I think that the easiest way to identify Christian nationalist legislation is really thinking about imposing Christian views in our public school system. And there's a coordinated effort to do that, launched by an organization called Project Blitz, which has actually changed its name recently to Freedom for All. But it's created a playbook for sample legislation that's being introduced in state houses around the country to imbue Christian views in public education. And actually, Texas, the most recent legislative session in Texas is quite an example of this kind of legislation. The recent legislative session last winter, spring, included legislation that would have required public schools to display 10 commandments in the classroom. It would have enabled school prayer in the classroom, and actually a successful bill that passed is to allow school districts to hire chaplains, faith-based chaplains in public schools, either as volunteers or by using the funds that were previously allocated for school guidance counselors. And so here at Interfaith Alliance, we're deeply concerned about that legislation. And we've actually been working in Texas to urge school districts not to adopt the chaplain program, and of course are keeping our eye on similar legislation around the country. That chaplain bill was also introduced in Ohio, and similar initiatives around the country. There was legislation that passed Louisiana this past session that requires a sign in every classroom saying, "In God we trust." So that's very, very clear. Thinking about anti-LGBTQ legislation, of course, that goes back to what our previous panelists were talking about, a very narrow view of who deserves equality and equal rights in this country. During the last legislative session, according to the Human Rights Campaign, over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills were passed in states around the country. This is to limit gender-affirming care. It's to limit bathroom usage. It's to enable discrimination. This is a record-breaking number that last year is more than the previous 5 years combined. So not only is this an overwhelming effort, but it's increasing, and 70 of those bills passed. And so that's something that we as advocates need to keep our eye on. We need to keep advocating to oppose that kind of legislation and ensure fair treatment and equality for all. And as I mentioned before, the anti-democratic voter restriction legislation that are connected with Christian nationalism, both to drown out minority voices and to help consolidate their power. So a record number of legislation that was introduced to suppress voter access by minorities, by others that have differing voices, legislation to call into question the legitimacy of our elections and the legitimacy of election officials, and of course, the gerrymandering in the courts that reduces the power of minority voters.
So interesting. And you know, what is interesting when you look at these discussions going on, I'm just remembering what happened in Tennessee earlier this year. That you always, I know that both of our former speakers talked about the underlying violence around some of these discussions, and just the not only the content of the policy itself, but the atmosphere, the bullying, frankly, in so many situations. So thank you for bringing that to us. Putting these campaigns together costs money, right? So I am wondering what you have found, Darcy, in terms of who's funding this work. In terms of mobilizing political action, it's expensive. So what are you learning? What have you learned? And is there somebody in particular that you can just give us maybe an example that is influencing this kind of power to move this agenda forward?
Yes, I can give you a few examples. I mean, the fact is, as we've said, this is a coordinated national campaign, and it coordination takes money, and they're successful as far as the numbers of legislation that we're seeing introduced, the control that has been taken over the court system, the federal courts and our Supreme Court. So I'm going to give you a few examples. So first, in thinking about, and I'll get more specific, but thinking about the effort to curb LGBTQ rights, the two largest organizations behind those efforts are the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Family Research Council. The Alliance of Defending Freedom has increased its donations over the last 20 years to the last reported year was $78 million, mainly from grants and donations. One donor gave over $31 million in that year. And while donors' identities are reported on federal tax returns, the information is not made public under the IRS guidelines. And this organization has actually been active in preventing public disclosure of its donors' names, both in courts and through grassroots organizing. For example, it won a Supreme Court case that ended California's requirement for nonprofits to release the names of their donors. So this is intentional. And just the Family Research Council also gets most of its money through grants and donations. And it 2 years ago changed its IRS status to an association of churches so that it's no longer required to file a public tax return. So that's just one example of the significant amount of wealth that is amassing that's enabling these organizations to quietly influence policy in this way. Thinking about the Texas examples I gave, there's actually two individuals in Texas named Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilkes who made their money in oil and fracking. One of them is a pastor, and they've been largely behind the school prayer efforts to funnel public money into private education. And they donated roughly $30 million to far-right legislatures over the last 10 years. And so there are examples of this in states around the country. And last, of course, a name that's on everyone's tongue these days is Leonard Leo, who we all know is President Trump's advisor on judicial nominations. And so, we know of his efforts to kind of stack the court. What may not be as obvious is that he actually received a $1.6 billion gift 2 years ago, and it was made in such a way that he was able to avoid paying over $400 million in taxes. And it's that money that has been funneled in various ways, both around conservative court majorities, but for example, the 303 creative case, the Supreme Court case that was handed down this summer that allows private businesses to discriminate against LGBTQ clients. those funds were connected to 6 different organizations that wrote amicus briefs in that case. And similarly, those Leo funds were also connected to another Supreme Court case this year, Allen versus Milligan, a North Carolina case that would have allowed state legislatures to draw lines for the party of their favor. And thank goodness the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. But it's that kind of money that's enabling this kind of progress in the courts and in the state legislatures around the country.
Yeah, it is not surprising that even in the Supreme Court this year, you've got a case called the Moore case, where the court is going to decide whether or not you can tax wealth. So perhaps coincidental, perhaps not. Just want to, for our final question, many of the issues you described at the local level, efforts to restrict voting, the anti-LGBTQ legislation, efforts to defund the public schools, we are all seeing these in Congress this year, particularly by the small set of ultra-conservative Republicans in the House. So what is the connection between what is happening in the state and what we are seeing in Congress?
It's all connected, Laura. As you said at the beginning of our discussion, the states are a testing laboratory for what happens in the federal government, and it's the same organizations that are behind similar legislation in Congress. And as we all know, largely members of Congress are coming from state legislatures. That's kind of how they came up, and they bring their donors, they bring their views, they bring their constituents with them. That's how our democracy works, and ideally it works in a positive way. But the anti-LGBTQ legislation that I talked about in state houses, that's being replicated in our federal budget process. As many of you know, we don't have a federal budget right now because we don't have a speaker. But once they elect a speaker, they're going to have to negotiate a federal budget very, very soon. And we saw this fall that over 40 anti-LGBTQ riders were included in the budget process. So these are bills that would prohibit gender-affirming care for service members and their families. It would prohibit gay pride flags from flying at government institutions. I mean, why are these culture war kind of issues being included in the federal budget negotiation? It's because of the normalization and the spread of kind of Christian nationalism and white supremacy around our country that's being reflected in legislation and really taking hostage of our federal budget that should be used to allocate funds for defense and social services program and pay our federal employees.
Yeah. What you're saying reminds me a little bit of what Father Massingale said in terms of we will know you are Christian and by what. I often think of when, if you only have to care about one issue, then the question of money and resources, particularly for the vulnerable, as called in the Christian gospel, is set aside. And perhaps it is not surprising during the Trump administration that you had a whole situation where for the first 9 months of the term, the attempt was to pull healthcare away from millions of people. And then a very quick pivot after that to passing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, where you had $2 trillion with a T, of dollars of tax benefits going to the wealthiest folks in America, many of whom are these very donors, Darcy, that you are talking about. Any final thought that you want to leave with the audience? I know we are going to have our two primary guests here coming back to talk to us a little bit more. But what is important from your perspective? What should we be doing in the policy space to make sure that our people, meaning the collective, multiracial, multi-faith coalition, is able to be successful against these threats?
I always love that question. Thank you, Laura. The key is to identify where Christian nationalism and white supremacy are showing up in legislation in the county level, on the state level, in the federal level, in elections. And that goes from up from school boards to your county, to your state, to your members of Congress and president. Pay attention, draw these connections, and think about where your voice matters. I think it's critical that communities of faith, that people of faith speak out against Christian nationalist rhetoric, legislation. I read something recently that said Christian nationalism is window dressing around an ideology of hate. And I think it's so critical for people of faith to act out, to speak out, and to vote.
I just want to say amen, Darcy. We at Network and our partners look forward to continuing to engage in for us, it's the federal space. We are so happy that you and the coalition are working very hard at the state and local level for justice. And clearly, as we move into next year, it's going to be a necessity for people who believe in what I would call true values, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, people who are faithful to goodness work together to make the difference. We are at that point in time, and just very, very happy that you're with us today, Darcy. Look forward to continuing the conversation, and I think we are likely moving on. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura and Darcy. That was quite informative. We can talk about these issues of Christian nationalism and white supremacy in the abstract, but it's important to understand and to know how they actually influence our laws, our public policies, and of course, our politics as we see them, the politics actually working out in real time today. I want to bring Father Bryan and Robbie back to the conversation and just ask a question about having heard the conversation with Laura and Darcy. Why is it that we're even having this discussion about people of faith and the political power, for instance, of people of faith in this particular moment? Is there really a compelling reason why people of faith are really important at this point in our history and in our democracy?
I'll start. I think it's really important because our faith is on the line. One of the fundamental convictions that unites the great Abrahamic religions of Christianity and Judaism and Islam is that at our core, we believe in the equal human dignity of every human person. Now, we have all three religions have a very checkered and tragic way of living that conviction out. But at the core, this is who we say we stand for. This is what we stand for, that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God. And that means that we therefore commit ourselves to defending fundamental human rights, that the right to education, the right to life, the right to a safe environment, all of these flow from our God-given human dignity. And I think we've reached the inflection point where we have to challenge ourselves that all means all. There are no, so when I teach this in class, I say there's no small print, there's no exception clauses here. All means that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And that means that everyone, as I said, the prisoner who was imprisoned, and I, and who's ever been Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, all of these people have an equal human dignity. Now, do we believe that or don't we? And that is really the reason why voices of faith, communities of faith are so important right now, because not only is our democracy at stake, but the integrity of our faith is at stake. Who do we stand for? What do we stand for? This is the reason why these political conversations, people sometimes always get mad at me for preaching politics. Well, not the church I preach at now, but they're usually, and if I teach in certain churches bringing politics in the pulpit. And I said, why? Because political decisions are the ways in which people get fed. Political decisions are the ways in which people have access to health care. Political decisions are whether rights are defended or not. And political decisions that are ways in which we show love for neighbor. Mm-hmm. This is the reason why we as a community of faith have to be involved in this conversation, and why it's so important at this particular point in our nation's history.
I think the one thing I would say, Joan, is to that question of like, what's going on now? Why now? I do think it has to do with the changing demographics in the country. And that is why now. So if you look at it, this is I don't usually typically don't use the words Christian nationalism without the word white in front of it, because it is essentially a white Christian nationalist movement. And it's not to say there are no people of color involved at all. There are, but it is driven by an ideology of white supremacy, that really does trace its way all the way back to these assertions of the superiority of Europe and Christianity and European Christianity. So I think that's important to kind of hang on to when we're thinking about this. And it's absolutely right that and I think the public gets it, that we're at an inflection point. We're at a hinge point in American history, right? 20 years ago, the country was still majority white and Christian. Today, it is 42% white and Christian, right? And that's how quickly the country has changed. And you'll notice that this movement has appeared, no coincidence, as this demographic shift and as the sea change has happened, right? That we're no longer a majority white Christian country, and that those numbers continue to go down. And so the question then of democracy, and whether we really mean it when we say we support democracy, are really coming to the fore. Do we support democracy when our preferred candidate loses? That's the real test of whether you support democracy or not, right? Not whether we seize the machinery and assure a certain outcome because we think God has given us the right to do that. I think that's the real thing that we're seeing rear its head. And exactly right, that because of this conflation, it does mean that our faith is in jeopardy, right? Then are we, is our Christian faith out to prop up white supremacy? And the truth of the matter is, we have let it do that. In many cases, I can certainly speak to my own faith. So I grew up Southern Baptist. It is the largest Protestant denomination in the country still today. And its identity was formed in 1845 when it split from its northern brethren over the issue of slavery. Its genesis, its reason to be was to support, making the gospel, or to make the rationale and the argument that the gospel was compatible with enslaving people on the basis of the color of their skin. That was the reason to be of the largest Protestant denomination in the country. So it's not small, it's not fringe. Like I said, it's in our DNA, and it is. When I think about the struggle, I think that, we are at a point where it's visible enough. These problems are visible enough in a way that they haven't been, I think, particularly in white spaces. They have not been for a generation. And it's, I think, a time when I'm thinking about what do I want the witness of Christianity to be? And when I get my children and my children's children, what do I want them to think about the Christian witness has been? I certainly want it to be something different than the predominantly white Christian witness has been, as we're talking about King's take on it. And I think we've got that opportunity right now. And I think the reason why the fight seems so visceral is because those resisting those changes, both in the church and in our democracy, are seeing the writing on the wall. Right. And they're seeing that if they don't sort of take a kind of last stand now, but that means that we've got to take a stand at the same time, too. If we really want to push forward a church that's not wrapped up in white supremacy and protect a democracy, then it really is incumbent upon us. And I think these next 10 years are going to be really critical in the history of the country.
Yeah. I think that I certainly agree with that. And I also think that, Robbie, it's it's the numbers. Who we elect matters. And Christians, people of faith, especially Catholics, are often swing votes. And so it is important for us to have this conversation so that we do put the truth in the mix in terms of the discernment of those people who will vote in the elections that are upcoming in 2024 and every election after that, in order to preserve our democracy and to preserve the integrity of our Christian faith. So I think that's another reason why, and I think your research tells us that, right?
It does. One thing I'll say about Catholics being swing voters, that is only true if you look at Catholics as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at Catholics by race, you see a very different picture. And I've talked plenty about the problems of my own denomination here. So, but I think it's worth saying that what do we make of the color line in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
Amen.
We 6 in 10 white Catholics voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. 3/4 of Catholics of color have voted for Democratic presidents in the last two presidential elections.
Mm-hmm.
And do we think that that's not, a scandal? I really think we ought to think about it like that. I mean, 100 years ago, H. Richard Niebuhr wrote about the scandal of the color line in the Christian church. And he talked about this, that it should not be business as usual to just kind of walk by and look at our voting patterns and think, oh, well, that has nothing to do with our Christian faith. The fact that all of the white folks in our church vote this way and all the non-white folks in our church vote this way. We really ought to. And I think particularly, the onus is on the white folks who have been in the kind of predominant voices in the church to take a beat and ask the question, what does it mean that we're voting on the other side from our fellow Christians of color?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we started with history in this conversation, the origin story. Let us end on the future. And history tells us as a country that we have been in moments like this before. But this time, it seems like we are headed over a cliff or coming at least to a crossroads where we do have to make a decision. And Robbie called the question about the future. In his speech the other night, President Biden called it an inflection point, and the two of you have used that terminology as well. So the question is, can we preserve the common good when people see things so differently? And if so, how do we have a shared future in light of the deep divisions in our civic and church life? And finally, what gives you hope for the future?
Wow, that's a lot you want to address. Yes, we've been in inflection points before. I'm thinking about the Civil War. I'm thinking about Reconstruction. I'm thinking about the Civil Rights Movement. I'm thinking about the backlash to Reconstruction and the backlash to the Civil Rights Movement. I'm thinking about the election of President Obama, but then also the election of Donald Trump. And many commentators have pointed out that you would probably not have Trump if you didn't have Obama. And that, commentators have called it a white lash, a rejection of what he stood for, what they thought he stood for, this kind of the advent of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And the honest question, or the honest answer I can give, is that I don't know if we're going to have a common future. I think the American tendency is to always say, well, of course we're going to have one. But I think that we as Americans need to understand that that's more wishful thinking, and that when every advance that we've taken has always been one that's been deliberately taken. We've had to make decisions to choose that common future. In other words, to answer your question, will we have a common future together is going to depend upon whether we want to have a common future together and whether we choose to have a common future together. And I think that also then puts the onus upon those who have been privileged by unjust social arrangements and religious ideologies of the past to make the decision to reject those ideologies and to choose a common future. And that will only happen is when the privileged see that it's no longer in their interest, or when they see that defending that privilege is going to exact a cost that they're unwilling to pay. I mean, Martin Luther King said it best that privileged groups seldom surrender their privileges voluntarily. And so will we have a common future? The answer will be, do we choose that? Do we want that? And will those who are currently privileged by the legacies of an unjust past, realizing that defending that is going to exact a cost that they're unwilling to pay?
Right. Robert?
Yeah, Bryan, I'm gonna pitch it back to you because I want to hear about hope before I jump in.
Hope.
I think we heard his answer.
No. Hope is really a challenging thing because I think we as Americans, we tend to conflate hope and optimism. And optimism, I would say, is the American virtue, that things get better and better on this kind of linear progression, and the good guys always win, and sooner rather than later. Whereas hope is a much more difficult thing. Hope believes that good ultimately triumphs, but not always.
Yeah.
And along the way, good people pay a high price. What gives me hope? What gives me hope is the fact that my enslaved forebears went through horrors I can't even imagine, and yet I'm here. So something about that story says that we can have hope. The other thing that gives me hope is I'm writing an article now. It's called Dreaming While Black. We talk about driving while black, walking while black, and all the terrible things happen, but dreaming while black, and that despite all the horrors that have happened, we have never lost the capacity to dream and to imagine that things could be different. And that dreams and imaginations are the fuel that sustain risky action for change. And it's interesting you pitch it back to me, Robbie, because I'm gonna pitch it back to you, because in your book, and you talk about visiting Mississippi and the efforts to preserve the Emmett Till Trail, and you quote a poem in your book that I used in my homily last Sunday. So yes, because I wanted to talk about where do we get hope in this current situation where we've got this awful mess and tragedy and atrocity going on in the Middle East. Where do we get hope? And in your book, it's on page 100, you quote this poem, what we can't yet see but still believe. Just the title is so evocative. What we can't yet see but still believe. And I quoted parts of it, it's too long for its entirety, but this is the part that I used in my homily. I ended it with, I said, sometimes you can only see the tops of things, but radical imagination can show us what's not easy to see, can change the tide, can build a future in this place. Imagination lets us smell the flowers in the seeds we plant. What gives me hope is that people on both sides, the privileged and the subordinated, We've never lost our capacity to imagine that things can be different. And even when we can't see that it being obvious, we still, imagination helps us see what is not there yet, but yet we still believe. And I believe that what gives me hope are not only the efforts of people who are making a change, people on this screen and people who are listening to us, but the fact that we as a people of faith, we as human beings, we as Americans have never lost our capacity to dream and to imagine that things could be different. And the other thing in this poem, they talk about how their grandparents were slaves of the ideology of hatred. And the poem ends, I mean, I love this. I mean, they said, they will say hate seemed permanent, fear seemed forever. But we learned the ground is liquid, and together we decide where we stand. And now they will say, we stand as one. We made the trail better than we found it. And we will hold this ground. Thank you, Robbie. That poem has increased my hope, really.
Well, thanks, Bryan. Let me just say a couple of words about that poem, because I think the reason why I included it in the book, it's not my poem, by the way. I want to be very clear about that. But I was in the room when that poem was written. So this is a kind of really unusual experience. I was at a meeting of the board of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, and they were meeting to talk about their future plans, which has now come to fruition. And that was to create a national park that would be recognized by the National Park Service for Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till Mobley. And just last month, President Biden brought that into being. And so there will now be an Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument that's going to be jointly placed in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and Chicago, Illinois. But in that room, that kind of from which that poem was created, were the descendants of enslaved people and sharecroppers in Tallahatchie County in the middle of the Delta, Mississippi, very rural, very impoverished place, and the descendants of enslavers, right? And these people knew each other. They know each other's families. They know each other's families' histories. They know what their family did to their family. That's all in the room, right? And this group decided and worked together for over a dozen years to bring the story of Emmett Till to prominence on the ground there in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. And that poem actually got written out of a discussion that happened on the day I was there, just eavesdropping. And the moderator wrote it over lunch from the discussions that had taken place that morning and presented it to the group. And the really gifted, her name is Susan Glisson, very gifted moderator there. But it I think contained, more than a decade of faithful work on the ground against all odds in a very tough place to do work on racial justice. And so I think it's a great place to kind of end the conversation for me too, that like, if you ask me, like, where do I find hope? Boy, sitting in that room and seeing those people who had been there for a decade saying, we are going to tell the truth about what happened here. And we're going to make sure the country knows what happened here. And the reason why we're doing that is because we know we cannot build a shared future together when we have a lie for the past, right? That's what they were sort of building in trying to build a better foundation that would stand the test of time.
Well, thank you both. That certainly brings us full circle, I think, in this conversation. And we've had a significant and enlightening and timely discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Robert P. Jones and Father Bryan Massingale, for helping us to unpack and understand the political, religious, and cultural change that is going on in our country right now, and for showing us how we should interpret what is happening, and for leaving us with more than a modicum of hope, I think, at this point. Thank you very much for your contributions, and we look forward to having another conversation at some point in the future. I want to also thank Darcy Hirsh and Laura Peralta-Schulte for helping us to see how we can recognize and combat white supremacy and white Christian nationalism in our public policies and in our laws. It is true, we can make a difference in the outcome for our country, especially in the 2024 elections. We can put people in office who will actually work for the common good, the advancement of the vision of democracy that is pluralistic, equitable, and welcoming of all. The future really is in our hands. It's our choice to make. Let us make the best choice possible. And now I want to introduce our colleague, Meg Olson, who will tell us a little bit more about our charge to and action.
Thanks so much, Joan, and thanks to our marvelous speakers today and to all of you. I'm so delighted that hundreds of you have given up part of your Saturday to learn more about white Christian nationalism. We have heard a lot of sobering and frankly horrific information from our guests today about our church, our politics, our neighbors, and our nation. However, as Bryan and Robbie just reminded us, we are a people of hope, and our hope spurs us to take action to preserve, protect, and expand our democracy. Here at Network, we believe that embodying Catholic social justice is the best way to resist white Christian nationalism. For us, that means working to advance legislation that dismantles systemic racism, roots our economy in solidarity, cultivates inclusive community, and ultimately transforms our politics. And for today, that piece of legislation is the child tax credit. So earlier this afternoon, you heard my colleagues, Laura and Darcy, call out our racist tax policy that privileges and upholds white male wealth and allows billionaires like Leonard Leo to fund harmful, hateful, and anti-democratic state legislation that is all undergirded by white Christian nationalism. Now, turning to the federal level, as Laura was talking about, between now and the end of the year, some members of Congress want to pass a tax bill that would provide over $60 billion more in tax cuts for the richest fifth of Americans and cost our country more than $1 trillion over the next decade. At the same time, they claim that we can't afford to invest in children and families. However, I'm here today, standing with our coalition, to tell you that we have an opportunity to ensure that Congress begins to redress the economic divides in our country, repair the racial wealth gap, and prioritize children, families, and people with low incomes. We are calling on our members of Congress to restore the expanded child tax credit, or the CTC, and reject corporate tax breaks. And we invite you to join us. Are you with me? We know that in 2021, nearly 3 million children were lifted out of poverty by the expanded CTC alone, but Congress let that expansion expire. If Congress continues the expansion, we could continue to reduce poverty for nearly 19 million more children. Imagine that, especially Black and Latinx children. My colleague has put the link to our action alert in the video description below, and you will receive it in the follow-up email. This follow-up email also has the recording of this program today and our past recordings, and you'll receive this email early next week. So please be on the lookout for that email. Email your senators and share this action alert and this video with 5 friends next week. And if you want to take even more action, please write a letter to the editor. And there'll be a link in the follow-up email on how to do that as well. So thank you for your advocacy. We know that we have a lot of work to do, as we heard today from all of our guests. But today and this week, we can take a small step to resist white Christian nationalism by calling on Congress to reduce the US economic divide. For when all families, regardless of skin color, zip code, or income, thrive, our democracy thrives too. So thanks again for being with us and for taking action.
Thank you, Meg. We wish everyone a wonderful weekend. Thank you for being with us, and be well.